My name is Lily Carter, and I'm 29 years old. 3 hours after surgery, I came home with a discharge packet in one trembling hand and a bandage hidden beneath my sweater. Every step up to the front door felt like punishment. My doctor had warned me not to lift, bend, twist, or stand too long, and yet all I wanted was to get inside, lie down, and breathe without feeling my stitches pull. The second I stepped through the door, my brother's voice sliced through the hallway. "Nice of you to finally come home. Quit faking it and get dinner on the table this second." I froze so fast my overnight bag slipped from my fingers. Pain shot across my abdomen, hot and sharp. He didn't ask how the surgery went. He didn't ask whether I needed help. He looked at me like I was late for a chore. I might have swallowed the humiliation the way I always had. Except this time, I wasn't alone. A man in a dark coat had walked me from the car to the door and heard every word. My brother hadn't even noticed him yet, so he kept going, louder, crueler, more certain that I would do what I had always done: stay quiet, obey, and make myself useful. But something in me had changed. Maybe it was the pain. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the simple fact that I no longer had the strength to pretend his behavior was normal. I stood there shaking, one hand pressed to my side, while the man behind me remained silent for just long enough to let my brother expose exactly who he was. Before I tell you what that man said next, and why my brother's face changed the second he finally looked up, tell me, what time is it where you are? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like today? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If you had only met my brother once, you might have mistaken him for impatient or arrogant. If you had lived with him, you would have known better. Mason had spent years turning our home into a place where his moods became everyone else's responsibility. After our mother died, he stepped into every empty space and acted like grief had promoted him. He gave orders, criticized everything, and treated basic kindness like a privilege he could revoke whenever he wanted. I became the one who adapted. I cooked, cleaned, remembered appointments, picked up prescriptions, handled excuses, and learned how to move through the house without provoking him. By the time I realized how much of myself I had handed over just to keep the peace, it already felt too late. Even surgery had not changed the role he expected me to play. He had heard the nurse on speakerphone explain my discharge instructions. He knew I should be resting. He simply did not care. The man behind me finally stepped fully into the house and closed the door. Mason turned with irritation already loaded in his face. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. The man glanced at me first as if checking whether I was steady, then looked back at Mason. "Someone who just heard you order a recovering woman to cook for you," he said. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but it had the kind of control that made aggressive people uneasy. Mason scoffed. "This is a family matter. Stay out of it." The man didn't move. It stopped being private the moment intimidation started at the front door. I felt something unfamiliar then. Not safety exactly, but recognition. Someone had named what was happening without minimizing it. Mason shot me a warning look. "Lily, tell your friend to leave." He wasn't my friend. Not yet. His name was Adrian Cross, and I had met him at the hospital that morning after my surgeon asked him to review some documents related to my post-surgical care. Adrian was an attorney, but not the kind who advertised for drama. He handled estates, trusts, and complex family matters. He also happened to be the trustee named in my mother's will. I hadn't understood the full weight of that until he sat beside my hospital bed and asked me a question nobody in my house had ever asked me honestly. "Lily, do you feel safe going home?" I hadn't answered then. Mason answered it for me the second I walked through the door. The moment Adrian said his name, Mason's face flickered. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Recognition. Fear. Then he covered it with contempt. "So this is what we're doing now?" he said. "Dragging a lawyer into the house because Lily wants attention?" His words should have made me shrink. Instead, something in me snapped awake. "No," I said, my voice thin but steady. "This is what happens when someone finally sees what you're like." Mason stared at me as if I had broken some silent agreement. For years, I had been the one who absorbed his temper, softened his cruelty, explained away his behavior, and made his control look like family stress. Now, I was standing there injured, exhausted, and still refusing to rescue him. He took a step toward me, and instinct tightened every muscle in my body. The movement pulled at my stitches so hard I nearly gasped. Adrian stepped between us before Mason could get any closer. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise. Just enough to make Mason stop. "Back away from her," Adrian said. Mason laughed, but there was less confidence in it now. "Or what?" Adrian held his gaze. "Or the next mistake you make won't stay inside this house." That sentence changed the room. Mason had always relied on privacy. Inside our house, he could say almost anything, do almost anything, and trust that I would stay silent because silence was easier than escalation. But Adrian did not care about our habits, our history, or the excuses that kept family cruelty hidden behind closed doors. Mason tried to recover by aiming lower. He looked at my bandage, the way I was standing, the hand pressed to my side. "You act like you're dying every time life gets hard," he said. "It was one surgery, Lily. Get over yourself." Hearing that in front of another person made it sound uglier than ever. I didn't soften it. I didn't laugh it off. "It wasn't one surgery to me," I said. "And even if it had been, the least you could do is act human." He opened his mouth, ready to lash back, but the front door swung open before he could. My father walked in, phone in hand, tie loosened, already irritated by tension he had not yet tried to understand. He looked from Mason to me, to Adrian, and frowned. "What is going on?" Mason answered before I could. "Lily brought a lawyer into the house to start drama the second she got back." My father looked at me with the same expression he had worn for years whenever conflict surfaced. Annoyance first, facts later. Normally, that would have silenced me. This time, it didn't. "No, Dad," I said. "What I brought home today was a witness." The silence that followed felt heavier than shouting. My father stared at me as though he had never heard me speak that way before. Maybe he hadn't. He had spent years being too busy, too distracted, or too willing to believe the loudest person in the room. "Lily just had surgery," he said, but it came out like a forgotten detail, not an accusation toward Mason. Adrian answered before either of us could. "Then someone should explain why her brother's first demand was dinner." Mason folded his arms. "Because nobody in this house does anything unless I force them to." My father's face changed slightly at that. Not enough to fix anything, but enough to show he knew how wrong it sounded. Adrian introduced himself properly and explained that he was acting trustee over a recovery fund my mother had established years earlier. According to the estate documents, that fund existed to cover my medical treatment, post-surgical care, transportation, meal assistance, and temporary in-home support whenever needed. I stared at him. A recovery fund? My mother had done that for me? I had never heard a word about it. Adrian continued in the same steady voice, which somehow made what he said feel even more devastating. Over the last several months, repeated withdrawals had been made from that fund. The paperwork claimed I had already been receiving home assistance. It claimed someone had arranged transportation, delivered meals, and paid for supportive care. None of that had happened. There had been no nurse, no meal service, no recovery aid, no special support. Just me, cooking, cleaning, and apologizing for needing help in a house that had apparently been billing my mother's estate for care I never received. "That can't be right," my father said. Adrian opened a leather folder and placed several pages on the table. "It would be difficult to deny," he said, if these signatures weren't attached. Mason moved toward the papers, but Adrian closed the folder before he could touch it. Don't. The word was simple, but Mason actually stopped. That alone told me more than any denial could have. My father looked at Mason now. Really looked at him. Did you take money from Lily's fund? Mason's face hardened. I handled things because nobody else in this house was capable, he snapped. The money went to the household. Adrian didn't blink. The fund was not yours to redirect. And even if it had been, that would not explain why Lily was expected to come home from surgery and cook. I wish I could say I felt powerful then. I didn't. I felt hollow. Because humiliation is one thing. Realizing that my mother had tried to protect me and that protection had been quietly used up around me while I kept telling myself not to be difficult was something else entirely. My father asked again, more sharply this time. Did you take money from your sister's recovery fund? Instead of answering, Mason looked at me and said, You always needed special treatment. Mom made sure of that. I just used what was sitting there. That was the moment the room stopped being about dinner and started being about theft. What broke Mason wasn't one dramatic accusation. It was the slow stacking of facts. My father kept pressing, and Mason kept dodging. He claimed he was protecting the household. He said bills had piled up. He said no one else was handling anything. Then Adrian laid out the timeline with brutal clarity. Forged authorization requests, falsified invoices, payments for services I never received, and transfers that aligned almost perfectly with Mason's personal debt, expensive purchases, and a business failure he had apparently hidden from my father. With each detail, another piece of my life made horrible sense. The missing money, the excuses, the strange way Mason always knew exactly how much help I was allowed to ask for. I had spent years doubting myself, wondering whether I was too sensitive, too demanding, too dramatic. Standing there in pain, leaning against the wall because I was too tired to stay upright on my own, I finally understood the full shape of it. I had not imagined anything. I had lived in a system designed to use me while convincing me I was lucky to belong to it. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. You stole from your sister, he said. Mason shook his head hard. I borrowed it. Adrian's tone stayed level. You do not borrow from a trust you accessed through false authorization. Then he said the word that changed Mason's posture immediately. Criminal. Mason took a step back, then another. That was the first moment I saw fear replace arrogance in him. He turned to me and tried a different voice, pleading instead of commanding. Lily, tell them you don't want to do this. We can handle this inside the family. Inside the family. The same family where my pain was treated like inconvenience and my labor like obligation. I looked at him and felt something I had never been able to feel before. Distance. You already handled it inside the family, I said. That's why it lasted so long. My father sat down heavily, one hand over his mouth. When he finally spoke, he admitted what I had long known but never heard him say. He had trusted the wrong person because it was easier. He had mistaken my silence for strength. He had let Mason fill the house with his version of reality because challenging him would have required attention, effort, and courage. Hearing that did not undo anything, but it mattered. Adrian then added one final detail that seemed to land like a hammer. Under my mother's estate plan, the beginning of my post-surgical recovery triggered a property review. If coercive control, intimidation, or financial abuse was found inside the home, the trustee had authority to freeze Mason's access to estate-linked resources and recommend his immediate removal from any protected family property. In other words, the house Mason had ruled for years could stop being his home that same day. Mason exploded. This is insane, he shouted. You're throwing me out over her? Over one stupid dinner? But it had never been about one dinner. It was about what the demand represented: the entitlement, the control, the certainty that my body existed to serve him even when it was bruised, stitched, and barely holding itself together. My father stood up slowly, and when he looked at Mason this time, something had changed for good. "No," he said. "I am finally dealing with what I should have dealt with years ago." Mason laughed in disbelief, then went vicious. He accused me of manipulating the situation. He accused Adrian of ambushing him. He accused my father of choosing the weak child over the strong one. Then the real bitterness came out. He said our mother had always loved me more. He said I was the burden she protected while he was expected to survive without softness. He said he was tired of watching the family bend toward me. None of it excused what he had done, but it revealed the rot beneath it. Not responsibility, not leadership, resentment. The kind that grows when someone mistakes attention for theft and kindness for favoritism. I stood there listening, and instead of shrinking, I felt exhausted in a different way. Because even now, after everything, part of the burden still tried to settle on me. The burden of understanding the man who hurt me. And I did understand him. I understood him clearly. I simply did not care anymore. Adrian spoke again, calm as ever. If Mason remained in the house after documented intimidation, abuse, and estate misuse had been established, it could compromise the legal protections my mother had built for me. That ended it. My father walked to the hallway table, picked up Mason's spare keys, and held out his hand. "Give me yours." Mason stared at him. "You can't be serious." My father didn't blink. "I have never been more serious." Mason looked at me then, as if the old version of me might still appear and rescue him from consequence. But something in me had hardened into clarity. Surgery had cut deeper than my body. It had cut through denial. "Give him the keys," I said. When they dropped into my father's hand, the sound was small, but it felt enormous. My father told Mason he was suspended from the family business immediately. Adrian informed him that formal notice regarding the trust investigation would be delivered within a day. Then my father said the words I had never expected to hear. "You are leaving tonight." Mason's face went pale. He muttered that we would all regret humiliating him. Adrian stepped just close enough to remind him he was no longer the most dangerous person in the room. "Choose your next move carefully," he said. Mason grabbed what he could, shoved past the table, and slammed the front door hard enough to rattle the frame. Then the house went quiet. Not tense. Not waiting for another outburst. Just quiet. For the first time in years, silence did not belong to fear. I wish I could say everything felt better immediately after Mason left. It didn't. Relief came tangled with grief, shock, and exhaustion. The adrenaline that had kept me upright all evening faded fast, and my knees nearly gave out. Adrian steadied my arm before I could fall. My father moved toward me too, then stopped, as if he understood that concern offered, late still had to earn permission. He asked if he could help me sit down. That simple question almost hurt more than the shouting had. It was such a basic form of respect, and it felt almost unfamiliar. I nodded, and he helped me to the couch while Adrian brought me water and my discharge instructions. The room looked the same, but it felt transformed by one absence. Abuse changes the whole atmosphere of a house. It teaches everyone to breathe around one person's temper. When that temper is gone, even the walls seem unsure what to do with the peace. My father sat across from me and did not hide behind excuses. He said he had failed me, and not in some vague, sentimental way. He failed me when he let Mason talk over me. He failed me when he confused my silence with resilience. He failed me when he chose convenience over attention. He failed me after my mother died by allowing grief to turn into hierarchy. I listened because he needed to say it plainly. Then I told him what I needed him to understand. I'm not interested in apologies that only appear because somebody important witnessed the truth, I said. If anything changes, it has to change when nobody is watching. He nodded without defending himself. Adrian stayed long enough to explain the next steps. Temporary home care would begin the next morning, paid exactly as my mother intended. The fraudulent withdrawals would be frozen and reviewed. The house would remain protected under the estate during my recovery, and if I wanted, further legal action could follow. Before leaving, Adrian handed me a copy of a letter my mother had attached to the trust. My hand shook when I opened it. In that letter, she wrote that if I was reading those words, she was sorry she could not stand in the doorway for me herself. She wrote that care is not a favor, dignity is not something a daughter has to earn, and any home that asks a hurting woman to prove she deserves compassion has forgotten what family means. I cried then, not because Mason was gone, and not because my father finally saw me, but because my mother had seen the possibility of this long before I had words for it, and had tried to leave protection behind. For years, I thought survival meant enduring. That night, I learned it can also mean ending something. Later, my father asked if I wanted Mason ever allowed back. I thought about every meal I had made while sick, every insult disguised as a joke, every order thrown at me like I was born to serve the house and never belong to it. Then I placed a hand over the bandage beneath my sweater and thought about the woman who had walked through that door believing rest was too much to ask for. Not now, I said. Maybe not for a very long time. My father accepted it. That night, for the first time in years, nobody ordered me to do anything. Nobody banged on my door. Nobody called me dramatic for hurting. I took my medicine on time. I let someone else bring me soup. I slept without listening for footsteps. And before I closed my eyes, I understood something clearly. Yes, my brother finally saw who was standing behind me that day. But the powerful man at the door was only part of it. What truly ended his control was that I finally stood with myself. He thought I came home weak. He was right about the pain. He was wrong about everything else.